So welcome to our third panel, very long day. This will be our last panel here of the day. After this particular panel, we will be having a half-hour break. And then we will all go downstairs for the 2026 Nadi Rubalai Memorial Prize ceremony and address, and a nice wine reception afterwards. Hope to see all of you there. Okay, here's the idea for this panel. So let me preface by saying once again, not once again, but this is a pretty domestically focused panel, but there's no such thing as as exclusive domestic focus in these areas, and particularly in the translation prevention. So one of the things I'm going to be asking our panelists to explore is what happens if they start to compare the issues that they're confronting here in the United States in terms of increasingly unaccountable use of state violence in pursuit of executive overreach. How an international perspective can help them with their work. What do they see outside the U.S. that is helpful, comparable, different, promising, and then we can really crowdsource that problem once we pivot over to the Q&A, because there's a huge amount of expertise here. So once again, the panel is really not about who can be most bleak. The panel is. I think we can accomplish great things here. We did that. But we can absolutely do that because it's kind of nice just to be in a setting where you can hear other people talk about the same things you can lose and sleep over. So nothing wrong with that. And we also need to also talk about, like, the metaphor that I was using the other day. If you open your toolbox, what's in it? And who uses those tools and how are they used in different contexts? So the idea here is certainly with a focus on ICE. Obviously, what was referred to at the beginning of the day as the flood the zone strategy. I don't think it's a strategy anymore. I think it's just a way of life. Is that the illegal attack on Iran has chased ICE a little bit out of the headlines after the debacle of Minneapolis. But of course, as we all know, the attacks continue. The attacks have not let up at all. The administration in general, Stephen Miller in particular, have learned from the PR debacle of murdering citizens on television in Minneapolis, and are, as we speak, meeting to try to find ways to make this kind of activity no less violent, but more efficient and more less susceptible to public pushback. So it's not just about ICE. There is a great deal of physical violence that is being actively and potentially deployed against people in the United States, both citizens and non-citizens. There is just a factual issue of what that landscape of state violence looks like, and how we are to rate it and understand it. And then there is the crucial second question of what are the most effective tools, institutional tools, public tools, popular tools, to try to bring accountability and to rein in the lethality and extent of that violence. And so we have a great panel, and this panel is based on the model of, like, what would happen if we invited four really interesting, knowledgeable people who might not talk all that much with each other and just have a conversation. So so two of them you've already met. To my immediate left is Efrain Olivares, who's again Vice President of Litigation and Legal Strategy at the National Immigration Law Center. Next is our friend Tanya Green, who is Director of U.S. Programs for HRW, Human Rights Watch. Then we have Lauren Voss. Welcome, Lauren, who's a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And finally, at the very far end, Andrew Boyle, Senior Counsel, States United Democracy Center. So welcome all four of you. You know the drill. I'm going to ask a question, and then, unless you start talking to each other, then I will give you a withering. I will give you a withering look, and that will be your signature. I want to start off with Andrew, and just sort of an icebreaker question. This is not an ICE specific question. question, but I.
Nice, great.
So Andrew, I don't know how much or how little you're able to talk about your current work, but I wanted to have you talk a little bit about the legal case that you're involved in right now, and maybe talk to us a little bit about your insider's baseball view of just how much resilience and potential courts have right now in being effective response tools for the increasing levels of lethality and of mobilization and of irresponsibility of state violence. So talk to us a little bit about what your work is. I don't know how much you're looking to say, but I'd love to hear anything you have to say about it.
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you very much for having me, for allowing me to speak on this panel with such impressive colleagues. I work for an organization called States United Democracy Center. We partner with state leaders across the country that choose to partner with us on a variety of pro-democracy and pro-rule of law issues. And I think what Max was referring to is we've been involved alongside that work with some of the litigation around the domestic deployment of the military in various states across the United States, California, Oregon, and also in Washington, D.C., which is somewhat of a unique situation given that it's not a state. In that regard, in relation to those cases challenging the president's federalization of National Guard, bringing the National Guard from what its usual status is, a state status, into a federal status, and then deploying it against into U.S. cities under certain statutes that I'm happy to talk about in more detail if we want to get into the legalese of it all. I've actually, along with colleagues and for some of this litigation, also alongside other organizations, had the privilege of representing former military officers who object to the what they see as the weaponization of the military against the U.S. populace. They object to the extreme amounts of politicization that is happening in regards to the military, including speeches where the president and the Secretary of Defense have said that states should be seen as training grounds for the military. That litigation, to get to the part of your question about how effective the courts have been, frankly, has been somewhat of a mixed bag. Ultimately, litigation around the particular statute that was at issue in terms of federalizing the National Guard, there was also an issue about deployment of active duty Marines, and that's somewhat separate. But that issue reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal, but not on sort of high principles that you might want to think about, this is America. It was about, let's look at the language of this statute, and the way it's written says, actually, you first have to try to use the regular military before you can use the National Guard. So ultimately, it was successful, but at the lower court levels in Oregon and California and Illinois, you had sort of a mixed bag. You had district court judges appointed by presidents from both parties, including one who was appointed by President Trump, find that this was impermissible in various ways. And then a mixed bag at the appellate court levels, which said either we're going to defer to the president to a certain extent, and we're going to allow this to go forward for now. The the court, considering the Illinois court decision, said no. We also disagree that this is permissible. So somewhat of a mixed bag. But I've been talking a long time, so I won't go on too much longer because I want to hear from the other panelists. But I think that this is part and parcel of a larger trend of the problems with trying to place domestic issues in an emergency and national security framework, it's a very purposeful approach and tactic to try to arrive in court in an area in a posture where typically and historically the executive is given a lot of deference.
I would love to hear Lauren sort of say, what do you do, Lauren, and how does it relate to our answer?
Yeah, so as my husband told me the other day, you have 5 jobs. Think about that. So my main job, a German Marshall Fund, is a CivMil initiative that's recently launched called Democracy and Security Network. And we are working to address the politicization of the military, both in the US and in the transatlantic thing. But specifically looking at the US, we look at ways to provide resources to people in the military to help the civilian population understand the role of the military and what those bounds should be. I'm also a senior editor at Lawfare, and in that role have been trying to bring attention to these matters. I talk on legal cases, but we've launched a tracker of all the domestic deployments in the US since 2017. And you can see the legal justifications, which ones had court challenges, and what's going on that front. And one of the things to your original question of okay, well, what's happening in the courts? Can we trust that? Part of our research has shown that, if you look at the system, there's just a number of risk factors that are really acting against you here. And Andrew mentioned, one of them, which is this is a national security space. There's generally a lot of deference given to the president. But it's also that these laws are incredibly old and piecemeal, right? So if I tell you you can use the military in a law enforcement role when there's an unlawful combination, right? Nobody actually knows what that means.
When the president thinks there's
an unlawful combination, right? And so you have these vague laws from a time that didn't make sense, when there was no large standing military, when there was no professionalized National Guard, right? And so a law that says that you could use the military to enforce the protection of timber in Florida looked very different when that was written than what that might look like today, right? So you have these huge gaps in the system. Same with the Posse Comitatus Act that people bring up. There's all kinds of exceptions to that. There's actually 3 legal tests on whether or not it's been violated. There's not agreement on which one of those tests is the right test, right? And so there's all of these gaps in it. Then you have that deference given to the president. Specifically to the military, you also have this presumption of legality, right? The orders that they are given are legal. And that absolutely makes sense. You don't want a military that, at every level would be questioning every time they got an order. That would be a problem for our national security. But you add that then finally to this assumption that the system is being led by somebody who's acting in good faith. And that's necessary because the amount of power that we give to that person making those decisions. So when you put all that together into a structure, it makes it very hard to fix it through individual legal challenges. And so as Andrew said, it's one little piece. It was one provision of one law that could bring the military out, right? And the DC, case is still going on right now. And so as much as those cases need to be fought, that's not going to be what fixes this problem because of those structural issues.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Efren for a minute and bring in the ICE. I mean, we have at least three, but probably more. 3 different moving parts here. We have the United States military. We have the U.S., the state National Guards, and ICE. And with a budget of over $30 billion for this year, ICE's budget is now more than that of the United States Marine Corps. It's the largest and most lavishly funded law enforcement organization in the American history. And when we saw the pictures coming out of the city raids, in particular in Minneapolis, but also everywhere else, one of the things that was immediately striking was they did not look like law enforcement at all. And when you think about the response to illegal immigrants, They're illegal immigrants in the sense that they're undocumented, which is normally something that's treated on the level of a misdemeanor. You don't need ballistic vests, masks, helmets, and assault rifles to deal with them. So one thing that's, everybody's asked this question, I think we all know the answer, but I just want to sort of maybe burrow into it a little bit, which one is, Efren, and any one of you, how does this even actually work between law enforcement and the military, right? I mean, these are both parts of the security services, but in general, you would think that coordination problems between these two very different forces would be considerable, except now that law enforcement, in the case of ICE, looks for all practical purposes like military, rather than law enforcement. They don't look like cops anymore. First of all, why is that? Was this just a transparent, intimidation tactic? And second of all, can you help us untangle a little bit about how, both at the federal level but also at the states level, how these different agencies, these different agencies that are authorized for lethal violence against citizens and residents, how are they coordinating with each other? I mean, I know this is not an easy to answer question, but just can you sort of get us started on that?
I could try. I think the last part of how are they coordinating on the back end is a harder question because we don't know, and that's part of the problem. The United States has never had a federal police force as such, right? Many countries, perhaps most countries around the world, I'm no expert, but many do. And that has been by design, right? To diffuse that amount of power, and then the police power, it's a quintessential state power. This administration is trying to create that federal police force through ICE. And it's doing so in a very dangerous way for the very reason that you point out, Max, that they are increasingly indistinguishable from military forces, right? They are covering their faces. They're not identifying themselves. They're wearing riot gears and long assault rifles, battlefield weaponry that police officers do not use. It just so happens that their insignia is ICE, but you change that insignia to a military insignia, and it's no different. And that is very dangerous in my view, because the public is becoming accustomed, right, to unmasked, unidentified agents pulling people out of their cars, smashing their windows, shooting at people, such that maybe the jump from that to soldiers doing that is not that different. It's extremely dangerous and very different legally, but as a matter of public discourse, that I'm convinced is part of the reason why the administration is going about it the way it is going. And given the amount of resources that ICE in particular and DHS in general have been granted by Congress, I don't think we have begun to understand how immigration enforcement is going to change in this country. It's a multiple of 7x the amount of funds and resources that they have, and they're spending it on these weapons and these militarized vehicles. Now, I live in the border, and the border immigration enforcement has been militarized for a long time. It used to be Border Patrol primarily, using these types of vehicles, having these types of weapons at the border, right? Ostensibly for purposes of securing the border. Now that is expanding to the interior of the country and becoming normalized, the Overton window is moving and making these things that before used to be completely unacceptable kind of everyday news, or perhaps worse, not even making the news anymore. And we're approaching a very dangerous point. On the question of how well are courts holding up on this militarization of law enforcement, there are a couple of other instances where state governors have tried to deploy their National Guard. Those, California, Illinois, Oregon, even DC, with the veneer of immigration enforcement, I would posit that they've been politically motivated, right? They've gone after municipalities and states that are of a different party affiliation than the president. In the case of Tennessee, for example, where we are involved in litigation with Democracy Forward, the governor of Tennessee, at the instigation of the president, deployed the Tennessee National Guard with the excuse of too much crime in Memphis. We filed a lawsuit challenging that in state court under the Tennessee Constitution, making the argument, talking about old laws and old provisions, that the question is whether the militia, as defined in the Tennessee Constitution, is the National Guard of 2026, right? And those are the questions. We were successful at first, and then that injunction has been stayed. It's pending in the Courts of Appeals in Tennessee. There's a similar case, and I believe it was South Carolina, one of the Carolinas. I have not followed that case closely, but it's also happening at the state level, and that brings up a different sort of political calculus there. I think I'll leave it at that. As to, how are they coordinating? I think what is worth bearing in mind on the coordination front is that when there's a change in the party in power at the White House, the agents are the same people, right? Trump went out of office in 2020, the Border Patrol agents were the same, the ICE agents were the same, right? And if there's a change in 2028, most of the line agents are gonna continue being the same. It's the instructions that they're getting from their leaders. And when it comes to ICE, we've seen enough legal memoranda to see that their legal analysis and the directions they're getting are completely contrary to long-established constitutional provisions. Going into homes without warrants, for example, that's a major one. Arresting people without warrants for immigration purposes. So I don't know how they're coordinating between, say, ICE and the military, but what we do know is that the leaders within ICE, the ICE commissioner, field office directors, are basically letting them loose, putting next to no restraint.
So another piece of this, which is implied, but I want to name it, is the race aspect. Like, everybody knows that the folks that are being targeted are people who appear like people of color or appear to be a certain ethnicity. You know, with ICE agents just going up to people and say something to me, I want to see if you have an accent. And they're not doing that to white folks. They're doing that only to brown and black people. And so I think, or not only, but I've not heard yet about a white person being asked that. And I think that that's a really critical part of the package of the creation of a federal police force through immigration with this, you know, as I said before, lobbyless population as an in for much more damage. And I also want to point out that with the orders that are coming from on high, there's also the elimination of oversight and transparency in the DHS and in the federal government more generally. So there's not recourse, there's not accountability, there's not checking in. Kristi Noem did whatever she wanted, and Markwayne Mullin is similarly going to do it. Homan's doing it. Like, the people that are being put into these positions are following Stephen Miller's plan and implementing with no recourse for people, except the court work that's been done, but the internal mechanisms that should be in place, that were put in place when these agencies were set up so that they could, you know, have kind of built-in checks and balances, are no more. And then I also want to mention, with respect to the race piece, is the racial profiling is something that the federal government and CBP have admitted that they do, and they are litigating based on that argument that that's okay. And they have at least one vote already in Brett Kavanaugh saying, in the, you know, the Kavanaugh stops case, which is what folks are referring to it as, the Vasquez-Perdomo litigation that's ongoing. You know, if you're in a majority Latino community, of course you want to target Latinos. And, you know, that's kind of the mentality, and that's in immigration enforcement. But if that gets approval by the Supreme Court in the year after that, it will be put into the criminal system. It will be, you know, kind of the order of the day, and far more than in immigration enforcement.
You know, one of the things that you said is, you know, talking about redress here and the courts, you know, what happens is best case is an injunction that says stop doing that. Like, there's not punishment for doing these things or trying new things. And so new things just keep happening because there's not serious repercussions for trying novel legal theories or doing things that are clearly not legal. They're just told to stop, right? And so that, I think, is one of the big structural problems to address. On the comment that, you know, they all look alike, so not an unbiased observer here. I am an Air Force veteran, but I would say that just because they look alike doesn't mean they are the same, right? They're absolutely different, and a lot of people struggle, one, with like understanding that there's different things that they are allowed to do legally, but also just to comment on culture. Like, I think there's a reason why ICE was recruited and expanded now in the ways that it was, because you have a military culture of professional military ethics. Even in the National Guard, there is that same view, who tend to be more, you know, more law-abiding and have that brought up from the years that they've been in service. Granted, we just talked about how big the law is and all the holes in it, right? So that won't save you. But they're very different cultures with very different restrictions. So we just want to we want to keep those two things in mind. To the coordination piece, the problem with that is that it's really different in every location, right? Like, what was happening in California is very different than what's happening in DC, where you have like 15 different federal agencies on the ground with agents riding all together. It is, from what I hear, as confusing as you make it sound. There were some interesting things that came out in the California case about them trying to coordinate and the military not fully understanding what their mission was. So they're under a federal protective mission, right? So their goal was to protect federal people, property, and functions. So they're protecting ICE, but they're not allowed to do law enforcement, right? So they're protecting ICE as ICE does law enforcement. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? Can you block roads, right? Like, what is the scope of that? And then the ICE would ask them to do something, and they'd be like, well, we don't actually see a threat there. So, like, what is our mission? What are we actually supposed to be doing? And it's like a presence patrol, and you could hear all of that confusion coming out because they weren't used to working this way together. And I think you're seeing the same thing in DC, but, you know, their chains of command are completely different. And they, you know, there was a lot of documentation that came out in California that the military was told that you have a military chain of command. You should not have somebody from ICE telling you what to do. So you both go up, but at some point those meet.
Just want to pick up on a few points that I've heard that, one, on the visual aspect of it, another angle of it now is particularly National Guard, when they are deployed by governors in order to assist communities now. You're seeing things like the National Guard not only not wearing masks because they don't want to be confused with other people wearing camouflage from the federal government, but also wearing things like reflective vests and things like that to say these is your neighbors that do National Guard duty that help you out when there's a hurricane and not these others. I think the point about accountability, that plays out in the military as well. We've seen large numbers of JAG officers ranging all the way up to the top fired. I think Hegseth said on a news program, you know, that's because they were going to tell me what I couldn't do or something, paraphrasing here, but something along those lines. And so it would be the JAGs typically that would say, you know, you shouldn't be sending the military into this city or that city. And that you know, that same aspect bleeds over into questions around like who is saying this you shouldn't be doing this under the law when they're hitting you know, civilians in boat strikes in the Caribbean and that sort of thing. And the other thing I'll just mention is that, you know, going back to something I was saying earlier about the way that this is, it's not only, I think, the instructions that are coming down, but I think that that's an excellent point. It's the message that's being sent by the leadership. When you declare immigrants being an invasion, you're talking in military terms. When you talk about invoking the Alien Enemies Act, that's something that you can only trigger during war. And all of this sort of makes it seem like it's a battle, not federal law enforcement.
Yeah, I gotta jump in on that point. I mean, I think that is what worries me the most going forward. I'd be curious what other people are worried about going forward is this, Antifa is a domestic terrorist organization, which doesn't have a legal meaning, but like that, but that does change like the way that people think about it, the way that the government thinks about it, right? And so these conversations around, protesters as terrorists, fentanyl and its chemical precursors is WMD. Like we're shifting the way we think about these things into that more military wartime environment and away from like your fellow Americans' peacetime constitutional rights and protections. And we seem to be moving over to that like wartime terrorist mindset. And we still have such a federal framework, after 9/11, that you just wonder, like, will that be leveraged towards this new threat?
I think they will attempt to do that. And on the rhetoric point, Andrew, invasion, surge, wave, all of those terms have always been dehumanizing. And those of us that work on behalf of immigrants, like, avoid those terms that dehumanize. These are human beings that are coming across for whatever reason. Now, that rhetoric is problematic not only because it's dehumanizing, but it is also making it a war framework for ulterior legal motives. That in a wartime framework, other legal things or other things are permissible.
Can I say one more thing on the coordination point, which is I also don't have complete visibility into how the federal coordination is happening, but I can tell you that one dramatic shift is the lack of coordination with state resources.
And local.
State and local resources, which only makes it more dangerous for everyone involved. And then precipitates situations where there are sudden protests or certain actions where the local law enforcement are not prepared to deal with whatever is occurring, and that can, contribute to a cycle of violence. So that's just to say that there are ways, even putting aside what is happening, there are ways to do it that tries to reduce harm, and those attempts are not being made sufficiently.
Okay, I doom scroll a lot, as does everybody else. And so let's complete the doom scrolling descent, shall we? And see if we can touch bottom before we come up there. So the context here is, what role does this administration's immigration policy and immigration policy enforcement strategy play in the overall vision or plan, if there is one, of how the GOP wishes to govern? And I think, I'm referring back to what M. Gessen said in the first panel, which is, if there is such a thing as autocratic breakthrough, then it's generally something that historians, if there are any, tell us that was when it was. It was that was the point where when we reach the point of no return and certain kinds of autocratic, quote unquote, gains are locked in. So the question, the doom scroller in me says, ICE has been created for something else than immigration policy. And then the obvious fear is it was to bring about an end peacefully, possible, violently if necessary, to multi-party democracy with free and fair and open elections. Am I doom scrolling too much here, or am I not doom scrolling enough? Or am I doom scrolling just right?
How dark do you want to go?
Let's make it dark.
The first time, I think you're trying to get at what is the point of no return, or what could that look like?
There's the two questions. First, what's the point of no return? And second, yes or no, do you agree with this? It's ultimately not about, or at least not entirely about immigration. It's about something else too.
Absolutely. I don't think it's about immigration. I think immigration and immigration enforcement is the vehicle for greater aspirations to, one, ever broaden the amount of power in the executive branch and perpetuate themselves in power. The first time the birthright citizenship litigation went up to the Supreme Court, not this couple weeks ago or last week, but the first time last year, the Solicitor General responding to a question from one of the justices on whether this administration would abide by a ruling from a court of appeals. And the Solicitor General responded, bless you, with a straight face on the record, saying that he could not commit to that because it would depend on what the ruling is. When I heard that at oral argument, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be in the news. It's going to be front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And it hardly got any coverage. So, and it was an immigration-related issue, right? And I mentioned earlier how the defiance of court orders has always been in immigration-related issues, the Kilmar Garcia Abrego, birthright citizenship, and others. I am of the view that that is because the administration considers that they have a blank check, political blank check from their base when it comes to immigration enforcement, and anything is acceptable, including murdering US citizens. And we've seen as much. What is the point of no return? Some people have thrown out that once judges start losing their lives, that's the point of no return. Because the shot across the bow that sends, and that's happened in Chile, it's happened in Argentina. Once that happens, we lost the courts. And we cannot recover from that. We're not there yet, but I don't need to tell you how this president is attacking judges pretty directly, and that leads to hate mail and death threats that judges are receiving. So we're not too far away from that. That's as dark as I can get, but.
Well, I just have to say that I don't like equating dark with negative. I think it's really important that we think about our language. not just, like it's all of us. And so when you said it's really dark, I said, well, it's really white, actually. And so I encourage us to think about that. But so I'm concerned a lot about profit, because I think that the doom scrolling piece, I think that the destruction of an immigrant-based economy is so much deeper and broader than is owned and acknowledged right now. And the only result of that is profit for somebody. It's got to be, because the detention centers, we have prison profit, prisons for profit, or for-profit prisons. We have now even like 7, 8, 10 times as much as what was there before for-profit immigration detention. Think about like the impacts on the population that this will have. And I can only think about the economy. Then we have the tariffs shutting us down. We have money spent on war that we don't have. And at the same time, we have the big beautiful bill and all the other cuts to healthcare and education, and also just elimination of the Department of Education and things like that. And we have no recourse. In addition to eliminating so much of the federal oversight from agency function, we have elimination of civil rights remedies from the agency function across the federal government. So there's no recourse, there's no remedy, there's nowhere to go when you get kind of like paralyzed by the fact that you don't have healthcare and your kids can't go to school, and the police are controlling the street, and the police means so much. It's not just ICE or whatever. I think it's power and profit. Those are the two kind of, like, that's the end point for me. I don't know, where it's on for me, but I feel like that's the ultimate goal.
I mean, the only thing that I would add is, if this was really about immigration enforcement, then, Minneapolis doesn't make sense by the numbers, right? Like, if that's what we're really trying to do, then, like, that shouldn't have been your central thrust. That would be a very ineffective way to get to your goal.
So I'm fundamentally hopeful about our country. I know that is fighting the question, or the hypothetical. But I do think that, as part of my work, I have the privilege of seeing how some states are standing up. And that brings me a lot of hope.
And I will say, you asked that question. I also am fundamentally hopeful because I also believe in the young people who are just like, no, this is not okay. This is not the country I want. This is not what the books say. This is not, or what the tablets say. This is not, the vision. And I also do believe at some point that the people who are voting against their interests because of their racism are gonna they're gonna hit a wall at some point and say, this isn't really serving me. So I also I can't remember when it was on our earlier panel, I still do believe in the system of voting, even though the roles are gonna be, they're being destroyed day by day. And so it's gonna be those changes too.
Just one more thing is that I think fundamentally it's not going to be a partisan issue. I think if we're going to recover from this, one of the things that has been something that's been good to see is people who have very different views from me on a lot of things saying this isn't okay, and being willing to join forces across a range of issues to say this isn't okay.
Okay, great. So this is perfect. This is we touched bottom. We're swimming toward the light now, and so I wanted to so here, in the first panel, there was there's a sort of a powerful anti-institutionalist argument that institutions won't say this, and so let's try to push back on that position and see how far it takes us. And so I don't think we're going to get a full-throated institutionalist defense here, but let's try a half-throated one and say something like the following assertion. The best, most promising possibility for an effective national response to executive power, in this case physical power, is for the Democrats to take both the House and the Senate in the 2026 midterm elections. Is that so institutionalist at this point that it rings naive, or is that a plausible position to defend? The question is where should scarce resources in terms of human energy, human personnel, where should they be devoted best?
Well, I have to say I work for a nonpartisan organization, and this is my personal opinion, because y'all love to stream things. I don't think the answer is Democrats. I think the answer is certain kinds of people who believe and act a certain kind of way, regardless of the party, because we've had Democrat control, and that started, drone killings. So, it's let's just be realistic about what the proxies are. I'm gonna stop there.
The issues that I work on, I tend to think are completely nonpartisan when it comes especially to the military, and that, we've had strong support for professionalization, for ethics in the military from both sides. I will say though that, I'm not overly optimistic on Congress playing their constitutional role. I think I'm more optimistic about good people in certain positions, and what they can do. I'm more optimistic in the average person willing to stand up and be on the streets when needed, and local organizations, and perhaps some push towards, protecting the concept of federalism in this country, more so than I am on Congress saving the day.
Yeah, and I think also there will be a reckoning. Whatever this is that we are in now is not going to last forever. And I think that a lot of people are going to be ashamed about how they acted during this period. And I think that's going to be a loss. I honestly believe that. I think that there are people that they think they have license now and it's gonna last forever, and I just don't, I don't see it. And I think that there's gonna be reforms as well. I think like the sort of like post-Nixon reforms that happened because it was such a problematic period for the executive. I thought there would be more of that after the first Trump term, to be honest. So I was a little bit disappointed. I thought that there would be more reforms, but I think that I still believe that people will see, how things looked when the tide went out and not like what they see. And for better or for worse, a lot of parts of our society and government that hadn't been tested before, and so sort of like caught off guard because they don't know, we have to take this argument seriously. I guess we do. How should we respond? And that takes a while to get ready. But then once you figure it out, you have that in the bag and you know what you need to fix and what you need to shore up and that sort of thing.
So just,
We're almost at time to start opening it up to the audience, which I'm really looking forward to in this case. But just one more institutionalist question, if you don't mind. The way that autocrats operate, it's not very imaginative. You capture any institution that can provide roadblocks or limitations on your executive power. And some institutions are harder than others. In the case of the United States, there was a sort of a half-hearted attempt at the capture of the military in the first Trump administration. Now we're weeks or days away in the context of the Iran war from the Supreme Command of the U.S. military to decide what they're going to do about manifestly illegal orders. So it's again a stress test. And so for those of you who have experience.
Max, I just have to correct you. That is not a real title in the military
Okay,
that you just said.
thank you.
So
The question then is, how do you evaluate how well or how poorly the U.S. military, all branches, is so far anyway, is handling, how much resilience does it have to resist its politicization and it's being captured by the executive? I mean, is there cause for some guarded optimism here that so far, knock wood, it's been more or less successful in pushing back or at least dragging its feet in being captured by the executive? Broad question, but anything that you want to know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. The first thing I would say is I just want to start from a place of the military should follow orders unless they're unlawful, right? So like there can be policy differences, there can be, beliefs of whether or not it's a good idea, but we want a country where the military follows all orders unless they're patently unlawful. What that means, though, is that you do run into circumstances where it's hard to tell. And I know we can talk about the president's comments on Tuesday as a separate issue, but in a lot of other cases, the law, especially when it comes to the law of war, is very complex. And it is hard to tell. And you have lawyers from the highest levels saying this is indeed legal, and that most people in the military are not judge advocates, right? They don't have the legal background, and they're being told by lawyers this is indeed lawful, right? So there's that complexity added to it. And so I think the education of especially military officers, but even senior enlisted rank, is very much so, one of military ethics and trying to do the right thing. And so I have faith in many members of the military to do the right thing, right? And to not follow patently unlawful orders. I think that the public, though, sometimes doesn't understand where that line is. To the president's comments on Tuesday, that an entire civilization will die tonight, that is obviously crime against humanity. That is, collective punishment. There's all kinds. There's legal issues with that. But taking the law aside, there it comes to a question for us of like, even if that the response is, oh, he didn't mean it. It was just a threat, right? But whether or not he meant meant it, he was trying to use it as a negotiation tool. Like, the question is, do we want to be those people, right? Like, do we want to be the kind of country that threatens to kill millions of civilians? And I want that answer to be no, right? Like, that's what I want us to say.
There was also a very interesting report yesterday that tweet went out at the worst possible moment in these delicate negotiations that were being brokered by Pakistan, where the Iranians were minutes away from accepting a fairly comprehensive peace settlement. But when the tweet went out, they immediately, literally walked out of the room. So that was an interesting report as well. I mean, it does, and we're going to get to Q&A in a moment, but it does bring up something, I think, again, that M. Gesson was talking about this autocracy playbook. And I was reading this Hannah Arendt quote of one of our students outside, and Arendt talking about the origins of totalitarianism. She talks a lot about that totalitarian and authoritarian systems are this fascinating, unmixed titration of extreme efficiency and breathtaking stupidity, and in this way that is sort of disorienting. Do you think, and again, this is not about domestic deployment, I just want to ask this question before we go to the audience. Do you think that, and we've talked earlier about how taken aback a lot of us were by how efficient and how prepared the administration was in January 1st, when it dismantled so many institutions so quickly, as though they had 4 years to prepare. But the whipsaw is that the decision to attack Iran is so manifestly dumb on so many different levels, quite apart from the ethical and the legal issues. What is this telling you guys about the broader context of what we're talking about the way that executive overreach can and can't use military force or lethal force to expand and undermine democratic foundations? And again, a huge question, but I'll just love to hear responses before we go to the audience.
I have a very quick thought on this, which is that the president is simply unstable. It's not strategic, and is just responding like a toddler in some ways, it seems, and undermining his own agenda and the agenda of his allies. To me, there's a good case that that's what's happening with that too.
And he's uncontrollable. So he acts, with abandon and is uncontrollable, because I'm sure there are people that are saying, no, don't do that, or somebody take his phone from him, or whatever it is, that he's uncontrollable, he has a second phone, or whatever it is, right? And I think the combination of that toddler behavior and the ability to act on it.
Be controlled by Republican members of Congress?
No.
I mean, in principle, right? If they chose to, they're choosing not to.
He's not a Republican though. He is who he is. And this is vehicle, and this is manipulation, and this is, some sort of strategy. And then there's the Project 2025 and all of the other kind of further back structures that are in place to make certain things happen. And so there are a couple of different puppet masters. So I don't think they're Republicans or in particular.
No offense to toddlers, but
I mean, I'll just say, based on your follow-up point, is that one of the things I've been most surprised and disappointed by is the willingness of those in Congress that have power that I think clearly could take actions to put their own political survival over the long-term good of the country, put policy decisions aside. I don't think that there's anyone except for those who are directly implicated who think that some of these actions are making the U.S. stronger by improving our relation with allies, by setting us up better to handle other things, by giving us soft power or anything like that. And so when you look at that, and in addition, and when you're talking about domestic deployment of military, you have to think about how this is affecting impressions of the military. For a long time, the US military has been one of the most trusted institutions in the United States from people across the political spectrum. And if you start weaponizing the military against the American people, you start losing that trust. You start encountering presumably recruitment and retention issues. Certainly, and I'm referring now to Civ Mill scholars because I'm not one myself, but you enter a dynamic where if it's a politicized military, then people within the military who maybe have different views of a particular administration in power, which changes, every 4 years, feel that their views are going to affect how they could advance within the military. And that is not a recipe for having the most robust, dynamic, adaptive military that you could possibly have. And so it's just surprising that you don't see more resistance just out of personal interest from some of these folks in Congress. And I'll say, going back to the point about the military resisting illegal orders, obviously the military is even more constrained. Active duty members or members that are still in the military are even more constrained in what they could say publicly about, what they're concerned about and that sort of thing. One group of people that can speak out that would have the gravitas to talk on those issues is retired military members. But then, of course, when Senator Kelly did so, Secretary Hegseth tried to demote him.
It was a court-martial threat, but that actually, then he decided to just,
Okay, so a lightning round to get back to where we started. And so I'd like to ask each of you, if you can indulge us. Suppose you have a toolbox that says effective measures to counter or respond to the weaponization of the U.S. military or the domestic deployment of the U.S. military. Open up the box, don't have to describe every tool, but what do you see? Legal tools, political tools, advocacy tools, rhetorical tools, any literal tools. What do you see in the box and what would you reach for first? You are.
Yeah, so what I would say can be most powerful there is unlikely allies. People who may not agree with me on immigration policy, but agree that having the military on the streets is a line that they're not willing to cross. I think that across the aisle, across the spectrum, a response can be very effective.
And building on that, I would look for the unlikely allies, like in churches, in little community settings, where not just grass tops and not just elected officials, but everyday people.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we need is more education on the topic. We started off talking about how people are having trouble distinguishing ICE from military, or active duty military from National Guard, and increasing the education on what are the rules around this, why does it matter, what has been the historical reasons that we've created these limits on these forces, right? And then as a part of that communication, there's been a lot of conversation around like the disinformation that goes out, right? That tries to justify certain things from happening. And everyone I talk to talks about the concept of pre-bunking, but nobody's actually doing it, right? So it's multiple pieces on the education side, I think is really where we have to start, right? There's plenty of other things you can do on, continuing to do the legal cases, preparing the legal cases when it's, illegal actions, support to people in uniform, so that they understand, what their options are. But to me, like the where we've got to start is the education and communication piece.
Everyone should vote if you're legally allowed to vote. And I think that accountability, documentation, there was some mention earlier today about some of the states and cities that are standing up accountability mechanisms. I do think that is very important to retain that information as it is live and present and for future purposes. I think we're also seeing a lot of innovation. We talked earlier about maybe some of the ways that these actions are spurring innovation and that wasn't there before. We're seeing states pass laws that weren't on the books before that would allow state officials to bring civil lawsuits against federal officials for stepping out of line. A lot of them, felt like they didn't need this. So, you had, for example, when you had a shooting by a federal officer of a protester on a street before, you had a robust mechanism within both that officer's agencies and the DOJ Civil Rights Department that would investigate that and bring that case if it was substantiated. That is not the case anymore. So they're saying, well, we have to find ways that we can be the engines of that accountability to the extent that that's possible.
Thank you all. Questions from the audience? Yes, who could start with you? Please just identify yourself.
I'm Greg Weeks. I'm hearing a lot of things here about the militarization of the police. And I think there's a much longer history than this. When I was studying military history in the late 80s and early 90s, I had a professor at Purdue University, Gunther Rothenberg, who was an expert on Napoleonic warfare. And he said, we needed to view the police as a paramilitary force because they were buying all this surplus military equipment after the Vietnam War. And I think that's where it really started. And then it was went further in the 1980s. That's one comment. The other comment is when I trained FBI agents in ethics, one of the things that always came up is people said, well, that we'd ask them, what would stop you from doing something that wasn't legal? And they, right away they'd say, the Constitution. And my comment on that was, the Constitution is just a piece of paper unless people are willing to defend it. And I think that's where we are right now.
Hello everyone, my name is Vadim Aznashev. I am from University of Exeter, UK, and I remember, because I'm from Russia, I remember how started the first presidency of Vladimir Putin. Several apartment houses were blown up in Moscow and in other region. I'm guessing knows very well what I'm talking about. And my question is about this so-called war against terror. Can you think that the state is preparing for something like provocations, like Reichstag fire in Germany, or these Russian terrorist attacks that were committed by FSB to start the Second Chechen War? So do you think that ICE can be used for the second war against terrorism, like it was after September 11? Thank you.
I dread a scenario, another operation like we had in Minneapolis, but imagine if the killing is the other way, right? If a protester kills an ICE agent. I don't know that any safeguards or guardrails would be left if that were to happen, say 2 weeks before the election.
Time files.
And I feel like it wouldn't have to be specific to an ICE operation, like it could just be some federal officer is killed. And it just, this is the excuse they're waiting for to invoke the Insurrection Act and all of the other justification to have the federal police do so much more. And permanently.
My name's Leila Halal, and I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about culture of ICE and from an atrocity prevention perspective. We were speaking earlier about how institutions are not enough and that institutions or people within them have to be morally inspired. And I do think that there is a lot of countering of, the public opinion is in the United States seems to be very anti-ICE, if not globally, because there were those protests against ICE on No Kings and so forth Day. So can you talk a little bit about the recruitment side of it and the mobilization of just average people that's going on in terms of building up this, what I see as a paramilitary force, and the potential for culture to be part of the resistance to counteract those mobilizing forces?
I know Efren has plenty to say, but I'll just say that, you know, it's notable that you get a $50,000 bonus to sign up, that your training is, 4 to 6 weeks at best, and that there's training being done by Israel, and that the tech that's being used is the same as Palantir and all of the really sinister tech that's incorporated into it. And I was not joking when I said earlier how many January 6th defendants have been documented now, ICE agents. I don't know what kind of clearance people have to go through, if there's a psych evaluation or anything like that, but certainly, speaking of culture, the attitude of the president with respect to immigrants is heard loud and clear in new recruits, as well as the people who've been there for a while, as well as CBP, the Customs and Border.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to pick up, just because it keeps coming up, the notion of institutions. I think rather than generalizing, maybe distinguish among institutions. I think Congress as an institution is not gonna save anyone. This administration has dismantled the Department of State, the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, perhaps to a lesser extent the Department of State. Those institutions are extremely weakened. Offices of Inspector General, Civil Rights, Civil Liberties, all of those internal checks and balances are gone. I don't think any political party as an institution is the answer. The courts as an institution are still there, but institutions are as strong as the individuals in them, right? They're not some abstract thing that works by itself. It's the humans that are in those roles. And some are really brave and are doing their job because of a belief and a conviction in important principles. And I think some of those institutions, states as well, can play a significant role in this moment to ensure that there is something to rebuild. I think this uncontrolled desire to grow ICE and hire a high number of individuals, give them a high-powered rifle with little to no training and money, it's going to attract exactly the people that they want to attract, but it's not the best individuals to do what that agency is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I want to add one thing, not being inside of ICE, it's hard to know exactly what the culture is like, but if you have not read the Wall Street Journal op-ed by the General Counsel of DHS, then you should. The argument in there is that the deep state has misinterpreted the Fourth Amendment for decades and provided additional protections to non-Americans that they shouldn't have. And that they have now reinterpreted the Fourth Amendment the correct way, but it was a deep state problem. And so I think reading that op-ed gives you insight to the culture at the highest levels of how they're thinking about what they're doing.
A couple of resources related, similar to that. There's an episode of The Daily from a couple of weeks ago of a former ICE lawyer.
The whistleblower.
The whistleblower,
Yeah.
I highly recommend that. And then an old article that's called The Green Monster, about when something like what is happening now at ICE in terms of growing it quickly happened at Border Patrol in the mid-2000s under the Bush administration, and how people that shouldn't have been hired, slipped through the cracks and ended up with significant problems inside the agency.
I'll just say briefly, some of the imagery, both in terms of the enforcement operations, videos of people being detained to sort of celebrate how this is happening, but also the recruitment imagery is deeply disturbing. And there's been documented cases of sort of dog whistles to right-wing neo-Nazi symbols and things that are in some of these recruitment ads. It's also been reported that the training for new recruits has been reduced substantially, which is particularly problematic if you're already reducing the standards by which you're recruiting people and then training them even less before unleashing them on the market.
I mean, just to chime in, it's now down to 46 days of training. A lot of that is weapons training. And what was cut from that training curriculum to make room for the weapons training was training in constitutional rights and protections, 100%.
Hi, Ashley Dua. I'm a GMAT master's student. We've been talking a lot domestically, but I think there's an important international point to the new immigration legislation, and it's that over 25 countries have agreed with Trump to accept detainees and deportees, even if that's not their country of origin. And whether that be for like an carceral agreement or just for them to seek asylum in that country instead, in return for financial compensation, I'm thinking in like a transitional justice perspective of holding people accountable. Since I know many of you are, legally trained, if you could tell me where you think the line is for holding those accountable for deportations, and then like the human rights practice in that country for those deportees and that process, but then also how it reveals as a whole, like other countries endorsing this kind of behavior and what that means for the international global governance institutions as a whole. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly bad all around. You're supposed to be able to argue against your deportation, and if you know that you're going to a third country and there's information about the human rights record of that third country, even if that's not where you came from, and you should be able to argue that. People are not going to be able to be argued that. I have colleagues who, we talk long and hard about how we can argue that this is trafficking by the U.S. government, because they are paying to put people somewhere. They're not paying for them necessarily to be workers in a certain kind of way, but in some places they are being forced to work. We've been able to document so far. So, I mean, I think we have to be both traditional and go after the processes that exist in protecting people, and also be creative about arguing against it. It's bribery and it's threats. And I am of the belief now that these countries are trying to just make a deal that they can live with for the next couple of years and then undo. But in the time that it's going to be in effect, there's going to be real misery and horror for people. And it's setting a stage and creating a climate that makes it much more acceptable. So even if they're, these kind of self-interested, Cameroon or whoever, every time you turn around, you hear another country made some sort of deal for 19 people for $5 million or whatever, and it's just like shocking. But it's their way of getting through it. And, the dam broke early on with the original. Costa Rica and Panama refused to take any more people from the first flights that went out in like February, March of last year. But ever since then, there's been this constant chipping away at the resistance.
Hi, thank you. I'm Dara Silverstein, faculty at Binghamton University. And I guess I'd like some comment about, we've heard a little bit about how ICE is this kind of different animal, but it seems to me that we can look at, for instance, the reign of Cheney Bush, not only with the militarization of the police force. I'm often remember the images of Abu Ghraib and Kristi Noem at Salvador, is that? Sorry, thank you. Senior moment. And also in this country, we've had this discussion about abolishing the police because of their racist practices. And so to say that ICE is kind of this different animal on how to coordinate and have better communication and have ICE respect our civil rights, you know, as a white woman, I generally have my civil rights respected, but many people of color, including many of my clients who are criminalized in various ways for just walking in the street differently, they've lived with this for many years. And so the preconditions for this, for our current era, which, believe me, I worry about every single day. I'm not saying, oh, this isn't anything new. But it's one of degree and not of kind, I guess. And I'm just wondering if maybe you could share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I said that earlier, you know, we've had people under attack by the government of this country since the beginning of the government of this country, since the founding of this country. And now it's more people and broader swaths of people. And with this weird kind of acquiescence by the general public, because it's, you know, immigrants who are illegal and this kind of thing. But that is turning. So I don't think that the way things began last year are where we are at today in terms of the psyche of the country. But I absolutely agree with you that there's a through line. It's, you know, it's exacerbated, but it's not new under this administration. And the remedies have to be, I think, graduated. If you're gonna have a police force, they have to follow certain rules, they have to behave a certain kind of way, they have to understand, you know, what the law is and that kind of thing, have the training and all that. But if they are untrainable, or if they are, you know, off the charts and keep violating, then you have a different response and so on. I think that in this moment, even though there will be an afterward, we should shoot for, you know, the moon that we have in our sights in terms of like true, you know, recognition of full human rights for everyone. There's a spectrum along the way. And I feel like we're right now in throes of something where we have to really talk about reasonable law enforcement instead of eliminating law enforcement, because that's where we are right now. And like the eliminating law enforcement for people who want that can still be a goal, but that can't be the message right now, I think, because we have to deal in reality and we have way too much engagement in this criminality issue on all the levels, you know, ICE, CBP, police, federal, National Guard, military, everybody in the streets. So we can't pretend it's not there.
Thank you. Thank you once again for the panel. I just wanted to make a comment. And again, this is an outside observer of the U.S. military-industrial complex. Going back to the comments that were made with regards to civilizational attacks. But we also noticed that there is an actual practice of targeting civilians in this recent war with Iran. I'll give you some stats for it, just off the top of my head. The Minab schoolgirl killings, where there's 3 Tomahawk missiles and what's the 3-tap strike on a schoolgirl, on a school, killing up to 175 schoolgirls ages 7 to 12. It is being cited as one of the deadliest single attacks on school-age children in recent history, and the largest massacre of girls in modern history. I'll give you another stats. To date, there's been over 763 schools that were targeted in Iran. I think WHO has reported 307 healthcare centers, hospitals included. So this, from an outside perspective, this doesn't sound like a military that has checks and balances. And then put that in conjunction with recent sacking of military generals and, you know, high-ranking officers by the administration. How are we going to go about restoring those checks and balances to bring in a military that can, you know, that respects humanitarian law and the Roman statute on that front? So to my question, are we seeing, how we talk about militarization of our police forces, are we seeing an icification of our military in that respect? Thank you.
So the first thing I would say is I think the general consensus is that the Minab school was not targeted on purpose for being a school of girls. I think general consensus is that was an accidental targeting. I think that there is a lot of targeting happening very fast for the Iran war, and that can, lead to inadvertent effects from it. But at the same time, we haven't seen the analysis on the back end, right, to know what is causing these or what was the actual issues behind them. But I am sensitive to the thought that the way that the military fights abroad can have implications for how the military might be used now, and that we should be thinking about that. When you talk though about the general officers or flag officers who have been removed or fired or retired, what I would say though is that's not only a negative story, right? Like the reason that those people may have retired or been removed could be to their fidelity to the law, right? And we just don't know though. That's part of the problem is much of them have not come out and said why they're there. I have cautious optimism that there are good people in the military that will keep their fidelity to the law, but I think the general public needs to be very clear that that's what they want the military to do, and that they will support those people that keep their fidelity to the law.
So how would you include the attacks on boats in the Atlantic and Pacific without due process, rather than taking them prisoners or doing what you have to do and bringing them into a court of law? Isn't that a worry about the independence of the military and the politicization of the military?
Yeah, I think that is actually a really good point, and I have no justification or no excuse for any of those boat strikes of civilians. I think what we need to be aware of is how large the military is, the millions of people that are in there, and the different services and units and type of people, and that they will be different and they will have different analyses for what they are willing to do and not do, and we should be cognizant of that fact. And that, even if some people may think that something is illegal and say no, there may be others that will say yes. And they may do their own legal analysis, or they might find other reasons to do it, but like the military is not a monolith. But I quite frankly don't have any excuse or justification for you for those boat strikes. So that is a fair point.
I think if I recall correctly, that might have also been one of those, at least from outside reporting, one of those situations where there was an individual who was either fired, a SOCOM commander who was either fired or resigned, and the reporting was it was because he was not comfortable with what was happening in the Caribbean. So, sort of as an example of some individuals willing to make decisions that are detrimental to their own careers because their values take precedence, if that's true. I only have reporting I've read.
Hi, I'm Sherry Betters. I'm a student here at GMAT. I have a few questions that I kind of want to put out there. One really is this idea of ICE versus the ICE agent, and my kind of concern about the defining something as ICE or ICE actions and how that kind of creates a cognitive dissonance for not even just accountability, but with ICE agents as individuals when they're no longer ICE agents. I think about sort of reintegration of any sort of past paramilitary kind of thing that we've seen. I'm wondering if you guys have opinions on how a bridge will happen or won't happen between those individuals as they get increasingly polarized from anti-ICE individuals. And then my other concern and sort of question is there's always this idea of a bad apple in these types of systems versus the system itself. But something that has felt concerning to me is that I know in 2025, 100, maybe over 100 immigration judges were fired in the United States for not really complying with what they were being asked to do, which was push cases through without giving people their due hearings. So for me, that looks like a makeup change of the court system even itself. So now it's like, is the court system going to have bad apples, or is the court system being completely made up into something new? And then my last point would be sort of this idea of, is there more ways to bridge with Indigenous communities in holistic practices that are would maybe empower communities to organize more efficiently versus sort of this protester military government sort of argument that seems to be going on?
So I would, on your first point about sort of individualizing ICE agents from ICE, I would actually, I mean, we're all using the term ICE, but, and perhaps Efron has a better view on this, but it's not just ICE individuals that are on the streets of Minneapolis, and there are federal law enforcement from a number of agencies that are there, including other agencies within DHS. And in fact, many of I think it's been reported that many of the worst offenders are actually folks that typically are on the border because they feel that they have been historically given much more leeway in regards to how they act when they're on the border versus in the interior, and they're bringing those practices within the interior. So I think that we're using the term, but we should just understand that there are other groups within the federal government that are potentially should be included when we're talking about who we need to who needs to be identified in regards to reforms.
On the second point about immigration judges, just to make sure that everyone is aware of this, that immigration courts are not independent courts. They're not part of the judicial branch. They are all part of the Department of Justice. All the immigration judges report to the Attorney General, and he or she or they is free to replace them, appoint them, etc. So think of immigration courts more like NLRB tribunals. They're administrative agencies. So in that sense, I mean, there's been litigation challenging some of these unjustified firings. I'm not saying that the Attorney General is free to fire them, but they're not independent the way federal courts or even state courts are as part of a separate branch of government.
Okay, last
But
question.
right, but the reduction of numbers has resulted in the inability to process the case.
Okay, so we have Ben, one time for one last question.
Hi, I'm Ben Valentino. I'm a professor at Dartmouth College. Just trying to bring this back a little bit to the mass atrocities question, at least in the way we're often traditionally thinking about it, but connecting it with the question of immigration. One thing I feel like has been lost, at least in the public debate lately, is the question of asylum law. And, as somebody who studies genocide, I've often said the most effective tool for saving lives from genocide is asylum. It's the ability of refugees to escape until conditions are better and they can return. And of course, one of the reasons why in recent years we have more migrants to the United States was claims of asylum. And I feel like that question of what's happened to asylum law has kind of gotten pushed aside in the public debate, and instead everyone is just talking about deporting whoever is here. But longer term, we have to have a position on what to do about asylum. I mean, we're, by almost any way I can see it, not living up to our commitments, our domestic law on asylum or our international commitments. And I just feel like neither side in the debate is actually talking about that, even though for a group like this, that ought to be one of the most important things we think about. How do we preserve the ability of people fleeing oppression abroad to seek asylum here and elsewhere? So I'm curious to hear your all's sense about what the future is there. Are we stuck in the new equilibrium where basically no one can claim asylum? And are the courts going to continue to accept that as the new equilibrium? Or is there some chance we come back to something else?
So the asylum laws have not changed. Congress has not changed the law. It's the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 and the asylum statute. They are in dire need of updating to the realities of the 21st century as a general matter. But what's happened is that through policy changes, through internal memoranda, through different practices, a series of administrations have chipped away at it such that today it's nearly impossible for anyone to win their asylum case, certainly if they are unrepresented. And it's been fought in the courts. What little is left, and there's a case in the Supreme Court that was argued last week about the issue of whether an asylum seeker needs to be allowed to even apply for asylum when they show up at the border, or can they be turned back from the river, literally, or the desert. So there's very little left. It's, I think, my honest response to that. And I don't, see Congress passing a new asylum statute in the next couple of years. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, this makes me think about the Democrat question that you asked earlier. This is the kind of thing that if Democrats were smart, they would be putting their heads together to figure out a plan. The reason that we are in one of the reasons that we are in the circumstances we are with respect to immigration and arrests, raids, deportations, detentions, all of that, is because there's no real plan that makes any sense. And we all agree on that. And this is, I would hope that somebody is thinking, there has to be an afterward. And here's a proposal for the afterward. Because you can't just kind of hobble along. And because the problem with what is happening on the streets with people being snatched is really that there's not process in place for them. So there are some people who are in court proceedings, there's some who show up for check-ins and things like that, but there are a lot of people who completely bypass that, and there's nothing in place for them. And so there's no defense of them. And so we don't have a system that works for too many people who are here. And that's a problem, that's a long-term problem. So I would hope that, if anybody's thinking about it on the Democrat side, they're putting their heads together to kind of map out a plan. Because clearly we have the money for ICE, we have the money for these bombs for Iran. So there is money, and it just has to be put in a different place.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.